President Trump has said that Europeans can purchase weapons from the United States. The Ukrainians can purchase from the United States, and that military might, that sophisticated weapons would be available then to the Ukrainians to both defend themselves. This is, we're talking about air defense, as well as deep strike into Russian military targets. So yes, that could happen.
Now, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed world leaders at the UN General Assembly earlier, telling allies to act in order to prevent Russian aggression in Ukraine, with a warning that without more support, other countries would be under threat. The speech in New York came after President Trump appeared to shift his position on the war in Ukraine, telling the Ukraine that for the first time he thought that Kyiv could regain all the territory seized by Vladimir Putin's forces. So is there really now going to be a change of policy in terms of the US approach to the war? Let's speak to William B. Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine. He was also a chargé d'affaires for Ukraine in 2019. Good evening to you, William.
Good evening, Carol. How are you?
I'm very well. Delighted to have you with us tonight. I mean, it was a very powerful address from President Zelensky, essentially warning many allies that unless they actually now took action to prevent Russia, then they too would face further aggression.
Exactly right. President Zelensky has made this point over and over, but it is even more pointed now that the Russians have invaded NATO airspace. I mean, you talked about Denmark, but Russians, as we remember, I was just in Kyiv for the last 2 weeks, and while I was there, the Russians sent about 19 drones into Poland. And a couple of days ago, there were 3 MiG jets, military jets from Russia that invaded the Estonian airspace. All to say that President Zelensky is exactly right, that the Russians, if they're not stopped in Ukraine, will keep coming for Europe.
Yeah, and we're hearing tonight, I think this is the second incursion into Denmark's airspace. An airport in Denmark has now been forced to close after drones were spotted nearby. Incoming and departing flights from Aalborg Airport have been halted, and the police have posted on X to say that drones have been observed nearby. The airspace is closed and the police are investigating. Clearly no confirmation as to whether the Russians are responsible. But do you think that NATO countries should actually now start then to shoot down drones if there are incursions into their airspace?
I do, Carol. I do. If the Russians are well warned, if they're put on notice that any further incursions into NATO airspace will be met by shooting them down. They will shoot them down. You remember, actually, in 2015, the Russians came into Turkish airspace, and the Turks had told them, don't do this anymore. It's down near Syria. And sure enough, they came again, and the Turks shot them down. They shot a plane down, a Russian military aircraft down, and the Russians huffed and puffed, and then they stopped any further incursions into Turkish airspace. That's what has to happen now that the Russians are probing into Estonian airspace, into Danish airspace, into Polish airspace. They need to be put on notice that NATO will shoot them down if they come into the NATO airspace.
But that would lead NATO into a direct confrontation with Russia, wouldn't it?
Russia would be causing that confrontation. If Russia sends military weapons, military hardware, aircraft, drones into NATO airspace, this is what NATO is there for, to defend against it. And really to deter it in the first instance, but the only way to deter it is to let the Russians know that if they come, they'll be shot down. Yes, this is what NATO is for.
We heard President Trump at the United Nations yesterday saying for the first time that he believed that Ukraine was now able to take back all of the territory seized by Russia. Now, he didn't quite say what the United States was prepared to do about this, but he did in his address indicate that he might be prepared to take some financial action against Russia in terms of sanctions, in terms of higher tariffs. Do you think that now President Trump is going to back up those warnings with action, that he actually will take some really serious measures against Russia?
Carol, I can't say for sure, of course. We don't know what's in President Trump's mind. He certainly has said that. He said exactly what you said. That is, he's ready to take very serious measures against the Russians and against any nation that buys oil from Russians. President Trump has this notion, which is a good one, actually, that Russia keeps its war going, this war against Ukraine going, by selling oil to the rest of the world and using those revenues to keep his war machine going. So if you cut off those revenues, you can reduce the ability of Vladimir Putin to pursue this war against Ukraine. At the same time, we all need to provide the Ukrainians with the weapons so that they can stop the Russians in Ukraine before the Russians get to the border with NATO nations.
But we know how well dug in the Russian forces are. We know that, for example, when it comes to Crimea, that's something that has been occupied since 2014. I mean, is it realistic to think of Ukraine getting that territory back, or does Ukraine have to start to face up to the prospect of losing at least some of that territory that has been occupied by Russia for years in order to bring an end to the war?
Carol, I don't think so. It will depend. We'll talk about exactly how the Ukrainians feel about this. The Ukrainians are not willing to give up legal claim to any part of Ukraine. Any part of Ukraine that is defined by the 1991 borders that every nation in the world recognizes, including Russia including the Russians used to recognize those until they invaded. So the Ukrainians are not going to give up claim to that. Now, you're right, it's going to be difficult to quickly move the Russians, push the Russians, drive the Russians out of the eastern part of Ukraine, Donbass, or out of Crimea, because as you say, the Russians have been there for 11 years. However, we remember, the West Germans and the East Germans remember, the Germans remember that the West Germans said they're not going to try to push the Soviet Union out of East Germany, and they got into NATO and they succeeded. The Ukrainians remember that, and they will say that, yeah, they understand that the Russians are there for now. The Russians are in the eastern part of the country and in Crimea for now, but in the end, they will get it back. The Ukrainians are convinced they'll get it back. That could be what President Trump's talking about as well.
Well, isn't what's missing in this any commitment from the US president to actually help out militarily? I mean, he's talking about financial, economic measures against Russia. He also agreed with you that if there are incursions into NATO territory, NATO airspace, then things like those drones should be shot down. But he made it clear that it was not the US that was going to be doing this. And he didn't even talk about, for example, a significant increase in the amount of military support that he'd be prepared to provide for Ukraine.
Carol, it turns out that there's about $300 billion of Russian money, Russian central bank money that is frozen in Western Europe central bankers, in the banks in Western Europe, and a little bit in the United States as well. $300 billion. Just as a context, the Americans so far have given $69 billion to the Ukrainians, and we're talking about $300 billion, which now can be moved into a fund that will allow the Ukrainians to buy weapons, to buy a lot of weapons, $300 billion, to buy a lot of weapons from U.S. manufacturers and others, to enable them to defend themselves against the Russians. So the funds are there. The funds are there.
But don't they need U.S. military might?
What President Trump has said, that Europeans can purchase weapons from the United States, the Ukrainians can purchase from the United States, and that military might, that sophisticated weapons would be available then to the Ukrainians to both defend themselves, we're talking about air defense, as well as deep strike into Russian military targets. So yes, that could happen.
William B. Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine. He was also a chargé d'affaires in Ukraine in 2019. It's been great to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Carol.
Ian's got in touch. He says, let's remind today's Russia what happened to the Germans in the Second World War. If push comes to shove, you get put back into the box. Russian Denmark, he asks? I don't think so. Thanks so much for all your thoughts. You're listening to Carol Walker on Times Radio.